Hello and welcome to FO Talks. My name is Rachel Dungan, and while I'm currently a director at Academy Health based in Washington, D.C., I'm here today in my personal capacity. Any views shared here are my own. I'm glad to be joined today by two guests, Ashish Chandrakar and Suraj Sudhir, who have co-authored a book exploring the complexities and significance of India's national response to COVID-19. Which many in the global space have heralded as among the most successful in the world, and perhaps one that can serve as a model for other countries. Their book, titled Braving a Viral Storm, India's COVID-19 Vaccine Story, presents a data and evidence-backed narrative that touches on the scientific as well as social, political, and economic advancements that undergirded the country's hugely successful vaccination campaign. So with that, we will jump right in. And as I read along in the book, I noticed sort of three distinct tiers or levels of impact that stood out. And the first was obviously the country's quite literal success in designing and implementing a successful vaccination campaign across quite a large and diverse population. The second, in country, seemed like India's use of technologies and targeted engagement strategies to build capacity, including health and digital literacy across diverse populations, was quite successful. That includes youth groups, indigenous groups, resource poor and otherwise disenfranchised communities. And then that third level of impact, which I thought was quite important, extended beyond country borders, India's visible role in vaccine diplomacy efforts, even exporting indigenous vaccines to many lower middle income countries, and generally, garnering goodwill throughout the global South. So many would perceive this as a hugely successful campaign, but I wanted to hear from you both a little bit about what sort of the climate was, or what the nature of dialogue was going into the start of this work. Were people trusting and confident that such a program would be successful, and maybe how has that thinking evolved over time?
Sure, maybe I can take that, and then Suraj perhaps can add his perspective. So, Rachel, that's a great question to start off, because see, if you go back to the pandemic times, the year 2020 was when we were all hit, and it was quite clear at the start that the only way to get out of the pandemic led disruption, both economic and social, and of course health disruption, would be through vaccines. So this I think this premise was very much well set very early in the pandemic. So now each country had to then look at, well, how do you get access to those vaccines? Now, in India's case, given the size of the population, about 1.4 billion people, the complexities around the socioeconomic differences across the country, could be in education levels, could be in exposure to scientific arguments, the exposure to independent information for assessing of what vaccines should one take, should one take vaccines or not at all, and of course the general fact that it's still a resource poor economy. I mean, we are about $2,500 per capita country. There was a lot of skepticism about how this process will run in India. And of course, the fact that, what is the cost of this program because of the size of the population and the costs of the vaccines. So I think what really worked quite well, and what was really cast in stone very early in our national response, was that the response will have to have a significant national component, which is to say that the country would have to have vaccines accessible through its own kind of hard work, ingenuity, and that's what. So for example, the first public-private partnership which was signed in India for vaccine development was in May 2020, very early on in the pandemic, just before the Operation Warp Speed began in the US. So a week before that. So fairly early on in the process, and then of course we also did a lot of contract manufacturing of vaccines for other whoever held the intellectual property. They would then license the the manufacturing to Indian players, which is a big segment for us anyway in the pharma industry. And so I think that the skepticism was very much there. It kind of bordered on disbelief that India would not be able to. I mean, the base case really was that we would find it difficult. So the fact is that the response factor that in, and then of course it was not just the vaccines, and it was about how do you get the vaccines to the arms of the people, what technology, and we'll talk more about that through this discussion. What should be the communication strategy? Because we were already, countries who were ahead of us on delivering vaccines, they were already finding it difficult for people to accept vaccines in many cases, right? So we had some kind of, let's say, early start on that problem. We knew that this would be a challenge. How do you communicate better? So those were the challenges. I mean, Suraj perhaps can add his perspective as well, and then we can go into more details.
Mm-hmm. He's offered a very comprehensive review of this. There isn't a whole lot more to add. I just mentioned that, for example, just given the scale of India's population, it wasn't possible for us to stand in line with an order numbering 1 followed by 9 zeros. That's simply too large. It had to be handled domestically in some manner, because there's the question of getting hold of that many vaccines, or twice as many, because there are 2 doses per person at minimum, and then actually going about executing the whole plan. It was a very wide, diverse country where you have the rich and the poor, and you have a huge amount of geographic and demographic diversity. And to do that all in a very short time, and the short term meaning that we had roughly a year to conclude everything, right? Otherwise, the thing would spiral out of control, like we had seen previously in the case of smallpox or polio, where there were efforts that were successful in a very much more smaller scale, but which spiraled out of control, because if we do not completely eradicate the problem, it just tends to mutate and get worse, as we have seen even in the case of COVID-19. So it was necessary to do it comprehensively, from beginning to end in a very short amount of time, starting from actually developing the vaccines all the way to getting them on the arms, and do that very, very quickly for more than 1 billion people. So that was the scale.
Yeah, I was going to acknowledge that. I'm aware that at this point, I mean, to date, I think it was mid-January 2023, I think over 2 billion doses have been delivered, just in the course of 12 to 18 months. That's quite sizable. And going back, Ashish, to the comments that you were making about the use of different kinds of emerging and innovative tools and technologies, for example, I'm well aware that, in order to reach groups that may be on the periphery, we'll say, of the population in some way, that often requires really intentional efforts to both, metaphorically and literally meet people where they are. So I know that drones were used in some cases to deliver vaccine doses to areas only accessible by boat. And if that takes quite a long time, delays can have implications for the effectiveness of vaccines on arrival. Or I know that the CoWIN platform, which is, for listeners, a modular, interoperable, and digital platform used to register and track vaccination at scale, took intentional steps to both increase health and digital literacy, but then also to free up toll lines and registration support systems, which help to eliminate some of those barriers to vaccination and also build public capacity. So those were things that stood out to me as being, particularly creative or innovative solutions that could potentially provide good models to be adapted in other countries. I was wondering if there are other solutions that you think were sort of most central to the country's success in reaching and engaging such a wide and diverse range of people.
Suresh, maybe I can talk about the CoWIN example itself. So one thing, Rachel, which was, and like Suraj can talk about his experience in the US, perhaps you would have shared some of that. What happened in India was the vaccination platform was a central platform. So CoWIN was essentially a nationwide platform. Perhaps in other countries, there were, different platforms by states or cities, but that is not how India approached the problem. India has a biometric authentication called Aadhaar. It's a authentication or ID, personal ID, which almost everyone has. I mean, barring those who don't want to take it, but most people have taken it. So this platform would authenticate you, a user, through Aadhaar, which means that then it's a unique record. Then it knows that it is you as a person. No one is impersonating you. And then the scheduling of the doses was happening on the platform itself. So you could take an appointment in your vicinity, you could take it anywhere, but basically you could search by, your locality, city, state, whatever you preferred in terms of the dosage. Then the platform would actually record what time did you take the dose, who was the vaccinator, which vaccine, what was the batch of the vaccine, the time of the vaccine dose, like the timestamp. So all of that was recorded centrally. So basically, and when the second dose was due, then the platform would remind you that you can take, you're eligible for the second dose. So the person doesn't have to go and track what her or his kind of vaccine status was. You were not kind of tracking the 28-day clock or the 84-day clock, depending on which vaccine you took. So that was done by the platform itself. So this made it a little easier because this was a major kind of concern at the start of the program that we would how would you remind people to take the second dose, right? Like how do you track? And then since the second dose, also the appointment had to be booked on the same platform, you had the entire information and you could get the digital vaccine certificate on the app itself. And then there were some very interesting things, like you could send a message to a WhatsApp number and you would get the certificate on WhatsApp, because in India, the Aadhaar number is linked to your mobile phone number. So basically there was a unique record which tracked, Aadhaar, which could track you between your Aadhaar and the mobile number and the vaccination record. So the three were tied up. So you could get you could just send a message and get a vaccine certificate. So this was quite important because it kind of overcame the fear that if you had paper-based process, people wouldn't trust, you could go to a place and someone can kind of just give you a fake certificate. So people wouldn't trust that. And in a society like ours, where, there were so many differences socioeconomically, it was important that the central system, so the central government took the kind of the responsibility to authenticate the veracity of your vaccination, which I think was probably the most important step in the process.
So to add to that, I'd say there are certain things that work in India that may not be workable in other places. For example, Ashish just spoke about the Aadhaar thing, and there are approximately 1.4 billion Aadhaar IDs available. Every single person, nearly every person, more than 99% of the Indian population has one. And it's not necessarily unique to the Indian citizenry. If you happen to reside there for 6 months, you become eligible to get one too locally. So it's for residents, not citizens as such. So it enables unique identification. And of course, from a Western perspective, the technological aspect is the really cool part of this, but there's more to that. So over the course of the vaccination program, it's been apparent that there has never been the kind of very high volume kind of effort, vaccine hesitancy, or people simply refusing vaccinations for various religious or political or whatever basis they might have elsewhere. I mean, there's plenty of people arguing about all kinds of things at any given time. It's a diverse country, but it never really applied to the vaccination program here because, see, there was a document that was released late in 2020 by the Indian Council of Medical Research describing in detail how to approach the case of informing people about both why they need to be vaccinated and also giving them an informed opinion about what kind of side effects they could face. And this was not done in a very top-down manner, but in a very diffuse manner, because there exists a culture of people being quite trusting of their local medical practitioner or doctor. So they were the simple people to talk to the people because they already have you take advantage of the social cohesion that exists and try to maximize that. And doctors and their local patients are a very strong bond that still exists in large parts of the country. So they were charged to explain to the people, look, you really should get vaccinated quickly. There are going to be side effects, and these are the cases, in which case we will do everything we can to help you. But it's in your best interest to go and get vaccinated. So there's a positive message over here, not having people talked down to, which seem to have worked extremely well in a manner that I actually find quite problematic here sometimes in the US, where there's a huge amount of noise and it's off-putting almost. You don't want to approach it even in a very, very sane way because there's just, you do not know how somebody else might respond. And that kind of thing doesn't exist in India, really.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. The onset of the pandemic, I was actually working with the Ministry of Health in another country. I was in West Africa. And so I saw their initial national response to the pandemic. And then after having to repatriate, saw the US response and experienced something quite similar, where in their case, the messaging had been very consistent, very clear. You got the same message everywhere you went. And I think at least here in the States and then in some other countries as well, we saw trust in science, evidence, authority, and some major health institutions eroded as inconsistent messaging or lack of transparency, or in some cases, yield of inequitable outcomes across groups created kind of a confusion and then also some negative consequences And I've been impressed and surprised in learning more about the fact that in India, it sounded like there was this kind of, large-scale public trust from the start. I would imagine also the messaging was quite consistent, which helped to then further fuel that trust. But I wanted to ask you about another kind of related piece. I did some reading, and some have indicated that they actually believe that there will be a rise in interpersonal trust, not just between members of the public and healthcare practitioners or public institutions, but even sort of irrespective of social group identity or historical caste associations, because there was such an overwhelming demonstration of volunteerism and civic support, both, in terms of healthcare provision and beyond. I know some have acknowledged the Prime Minister's role in helping to bolster trust among certain, marginalized communities, elevating the voices of Indigenous populations, acknowledging their rights, et cetera. So I wanted to ask more about that. To what extent do you think trust contributed to the effectiveness of India's campaign? And were any groups particularly mistrustful at the beginning? If yes, what actions were taken to kind of mitigate that imbalance in trust?
Ashish, would you like to begin?
You go ahead, Suraj. I'll add.
Maybe I can do that then. Historically, there have been issues with, for example, the constituents of certain vaccines being forbidden by certain religious groups. There was things like gelatin or whatever that goes into the production of vaccines, or even stem cells in the case of the US, and people prescribing consumption of vaccines on the basis. That was the case for the polio vaccine, for example, where there was either vaguely scientific or completely unfounded reasoning suggesting that the vaccines are harmful to health or prescribed by certain religious things. But while there was some initial noise about that, it was very quickly overridden by the fact that the messaging was consistent, as you mentioned, and it tried not to sort of feed those kinds of conversations by entirely ignoring them and just focusing on the message directly. So I believe there existed a bunch of negative messaging at the beginning, but fundamentally there was also a consistent positive message, but didn't seem preachy in a way, but tried to be diffuse and across the whole population, and that seemed to have worked well.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a few points, Rachel, here to what Suraj said. So see, one thing is that the way the society is organized, I think the trust in authority is probably part of the social kind of fabric where, okay, there's a crisis, there's a problem. So people do expect a role of the government and a role of someone who is knowledgeable in solving the problem. So I think it's also the way the degree of individualism versus collectivism in the society. Our society tends to be much more collective. So which also means that it also kind of believes in a kind of a hierarchy of opinions. Like if a government agency is talking about something, you would generally trust it, right? So that's a little bit different than how it probably plays out in other countries. And I think it goes down to the fact that the basic unit of the society, the level of individualism is lesser in India relative to some of the Western countries, for example. So I think that was very evident here, because when the government said that, okay, fine, the vaccines are fine, we have given them the emergency use authorization. So people generally accepted that view. I mean, of course, there were questions and so on, but the basic response was that, okay, fine. Then, of course, it was that messaging was redoubled or underscored again by PM taking the vaccine pretty much in the first few days of when he became eligible. So initially, of course, the vaccination started for the healthcare workers and the frontline workers, but when it started for a certain age group, which was 60 and above, so then the Prime Minister went and took the vaccine, and he took the Indian vaccine, the made in India vaccine. So that also became like a statement of faith in Indian science and Indian technology. It was actually a fairly standard technology, inactivated virus vaccine, but again, you had to kind of do it by the messaging was by doing, and messaging was not by saying. So he basically, and the book starts with that anecdote that he also messaged it very lightly, saying, oh, I did not even feel that the vaccine has been administered, right? So it also became a message that, it's not a painful process. Like it's not, you can trust the Indian vaccine and it is not painful, right? So it kind of a dual, simple kind of statements, but it had a real high impact. So I think that trust and authority, I think there's a difference between what we saw in India and elsewhere. And then the other authorities were used. So for example, as Suraj said, India typically has a system of general practitioners or doctors in your vicinity where who you trust, like, that you would know the entire family, or they're like the first port of call if something goes wrong health-wise in your family. So a lot of these doctors encouraged that, yes, you should go ahead and take the vaccines. They themselves took the vaccines. And then it became like a bit of a movement that people would then were posting their pictures on social media and sharing it on WhatsApp. WhatsApp is, I think, our biggest like network of, if you can call it a social network, it's probably got the most impact in India.
Yeah.
So people were kind of sharing their pictures and talking about their experiences. So that kind of became a nudge towards, like, okay, like so-and-so person has taken it. Maybe I look up to the person in my family or in my friend circle or in my professional circles. And since that this person has taken the vaccine, I would also go ahead and do the same. So that was, I think, the second kind of a response. But then, of course, there were issues that, okay, some people did not trust the process or trust the vaccine initially. So one classic example of that was so India has this set of health workers in rural societies, which is called Asha workers. Asha literally means hope in Hindi. And the role of these women, these are women workers, their role is to provide the first kind of healthcare, scanning of what is going wrong. So they kind of feed into the information network of health network, because the healthcare systems could be patchy in villages and so on. So these women become like the first, first level of inquiry or first level of information dissemination. So the ASHA workers were then kind of coached and trained to talk about vaccines. Some of them had very difficult time, and like we had kind of we have written about this as well, that in some villages they were chased by the villagers saying, what are you bringing? We don't trust this. But they kept at it. Like, they went back, they kept at it, they kept going back with more information, they kept going back with more examples. So I think that trust also built over a period of time, let's say a few months, perhaps let's say 6 months. So if you say January 2021 versus July 2021, it was a very different picture. Of course, there was also a big second wave of COVID in between. So people did see the downside of not taking the vaccine, and hence that also probably contributed to the process. But yes, this process evolved through role modeling and through, I think, a general, let's say, a difference of society in India relative to, say, other countries, especially in the West.
Yeah, I think that touches on a number of points that stood out to me as I was reading, in part because some of my own research relates to trust in health messaging, or trust in kind of health authorities and policymakers, and understanding what contributes to that trust. You touched on a number of those things: transparency, access to information, authority and expertise, or relatability, the extent to which my family has a relationship with this care provider. They know my history. We've established trust over time. And then something that's really important is tailoring. So even if the messaging itself is consistent, tailoring the message delivery mechanism so that the message is delivered in a way that's going to align or resonate with that particular individual's goals or values or ways of speaking, can really make sure that, that message is received and internalized. And it sounded like everything that you acknowledged lined up with that, those ways of thinking. Something else that you commented on, which is quite interesting, is this distinction between a collectivist society and one that's a little bit more individualistic. I thought it was quite creative that some of the major vaccine program milestones seem to be linked to significant national or cultural dates, such as the Prime Minister's 71st birthday or the 75th anniversary of the country's independence. And so to me, it seemed like that would sort of nudge people, to use your word, based on their sense of commitment to their country or to their communities. And I was wondering, in addition to just getting vaccinated, were there other actions or non-pharmaceutical interventions that you saw people practicing very good adherence to, something like a lockdown or a masking policy or beyond, that you felt like people were more inclined to opt into because of that collectivist culture?
Yes, absolutely. I think even the lockdown was quite effective in India. People generally followed the rules. We didn't see like the demonstrations which were happening in other parts. Of course, there were other problems in India. For example, what happens is a lot of people work in cities, right? So they come from the rural parts, but they work in the cities for their livelihood in the manufacturing and in the services sector. So many of them had to go back to their, ancestral homes or actual homes to their families, because when the cities were locked down, they couldn't access some facilities. So many opted to go back. So there were challenges in terms of managing the process, but generally speaking, the lockdown was adhered to fairly well in India compared to what you see around the world. But I think there was another thing, and as you very rightly said, that see the messaging of the response to the pandemic was it's a collective problem. We all have to contribute to solve it, and if you don't take vaccine, then someone else in the country will not be safe. Even if you believe that you don't need a vaccine, you would still have to make someone else safe. And to that end, also the vaccine messaging, Rachel, in our system was, no one ever said that this will not give you COVID or this will be like, end of COVID. I think the messaging was always very careful that you will not get impacted so badly in case you were to deal with COVID, right? So I think there was after some initial adjustments, this messaging was quite prominent starting in the first 3-4 months of the process. That this was not a solution to, I mean, it's not like you have a COVID, I mean, you have COVID and you take a vaccine, you get cured. No. Or you take a vaccine, you will never get COVID again. No. So that was, I think, very clearly kind of, I think this was a problem in several countries where people were saying, why am I taking a vaccine? Like, what exactly would the vaccine do, right? Like, so I think this was handled quite well also for most part. And also, there was an involvement of, let's say, cricket is like our most famous sport. So the famous cricketers would, post their pictures. Sports people in India were very, very keen to take the vaccine, unlike sports people in other countries, or they did not probably think of too much about the negative aspects. So I think that kind of helped as well, that these are fit athletes who are, and I mean, world, global level athletes, and even they are taking the vaccines. Bollywood, the movie stars who are quite popular, so they, spoke about the vaccines. So I think it was like a whole of society response, and it's kind of, the messaging was always, it was not like a binary messaging saying everything will be fine, but it was more like a sense of duty, right? So it was less a call to your scientific kind of understanding, but it was more a call to a national duty that, okay, fine, we need to solve this for India together.
Suraj, did you have anything to add there?
Not much more to add to that again, as she covered a lot of things. I'd also mentioned that India, the society, also has a very near living memory of the benefits of vaccination, because we've had a lot of illnesses, conditions that have been surmounted very recently or still are being tackled, like tuberculosis for one, that is aimed to be eradicated by 2025. Polio within the past 12 years. So people actually know that there's a benefit over here. And now this is about the statistics about negative effects. If you actually go to the current dashboard site and scroll down from a memory about half a page and look to the left, there's a table that actually shows you the live state of the number of adverse side effects that have been, and you can file something called the right to information, a petition with the government to get hold of more information about that. So you literally do have access to finding out how many people are impacted. And this number has been approximately a fraction of a percent for as long as I have looked at it. So that's not a bad thing at all. So you actually have this transparency. Look, there are going to be side effects. It's not 100% perfect, but here's the number. If you feel good about that, go and get vaccinated. If you feel bad about it and want to learn more, by all means, go find out.
Yeah, I had noticed that I spent a little bit of time on the platform just learning a bit more and looking at some of the data visualizations and other resources available, and was actually quite impressed by the level of detail, also the kind of ease of access, and the presentation of the content in such a way that, even someone who works outside of the context of our field could go on the site and quickly kind of digest some really important and seemingly standardized information, using national level data, which is in many countries not feasible by any stretch. So that transparency stood out to me too. I had noticed that in learning a bit more about what really made India's situation distinctive, something that kept coming up was the country's ability to mobilize resources, and the reality that, for example, I think it was the Mumbai airport has Asia's biggest import cold chain capacity, such that it was over 30,000 tons could be stored in that one location. So just having that resource available, or the opportunity to be able to manufacture multiple vaccines, including indigenous developed vaccines, that stood out to me as quite striking. But I was wondering, in addition to some of those features that were advantageous for the country, what you think were some of the sort of early challenges to implementation, whether there were any supply-related concerns upfront prior to when those vaccines were developed, logistical problems, what kinds of challenges do you think the country had to overcome in order to achieve its success?
So the vaccination program began with India, among many countries, being thrown into the deep end during the Delta wave, which began in India. It was horrific. This was in the April-May timeframe. And at that time, there was a very significant effort by various states scrambling to respond locally to the cases of the Delta variant growing and everything that was happening then, and wanted to take things into their own hands. But this was a challenge because every state can have a picture of what's going on within there, but not outside the states. And now the vaccines are produced for distribution across the country. How exactly do you prioritize and tell one state that you are more important than the other? It's literally not possible. So there was a case where everybody tried to bid and nobody really succeeded in winning a single bid during the month of April, when the national government said, okay, fine, every state you can go ahead and order for yourself, see if it works well or better than the national approach. But it didn't work. And we had to turn things around within about 3 weeks. But there's a federal system. Technically, health is a state responsibility, so they have a right to ask for, and they receive the ability to do that themselves. But it doesn't work on the scale because the virus doesn't know anything about state borders. It's going to be wherever it's going to be. So we had to find out what were the most critical areas where the vaccines needed to be distributed to, and that's fundamentally why I got interested in this. I wanted to see where the case is growing and how are things happening. I was just a passive observer, but I was collecting a whole lot of information, mentioning that online, and Ashish got in touch with me about that, and that's how in the end there was a book about this. So I want to learn, because there are things that are growing. It was not nationwide. There were certain areas that were far more deeply affected, at least short term, and things kept changing. How would you manage all that? Those were definitely early challenges that everybody faced, and I wouldn't say that we were any better at tackling them at the outset, but things got better.
Yeah, I think there were also the issues logistically, right? Like, for example, there were lockdowns going on. So how do you open the factories when there were lockdowns? So the government had to make policies which would facilitate manufacturing. So the specific deviations were built into policies that for these cities or for these kind of industries, you would make an exception for people to go to the manufacturing sites. I mean, when you say work from home, of course, in the services industry, some of the services industry can work from home, but the high-tech services industry and the manufacturing industry cannot, right? So you had to kind of make provision for what could be done. One challenge also, Rachel, was that vaccines don't have, I mean, all components of a vaccine are not made in the country. A vaccine would typically have upwards of 250, 300 components, chemicals plus the various kind of ingredients which go into it, the storage kind of systems, needles, the glass vials. I mean, all kind of the whole ecosystem around the vaccine itself. So in some cases, these had to be imported from elsewhere, and there were logistical challenges for that because the other country could be closed. Like, they could be facing a wave, and they may not be able to ship you the right quantity, or or they may have put a restriction for exporting some of this. So the government officials also had to then work towards resolving these issues, that you then basically appeal to the other government saying, if India is vaccinated, then that would essentially become a big part of the world population. So don't impose the ban for our vaccine development. India would also be the source for vaccine for other countries. So those kind of negotiations had to be done and appeals had to be made, and that was quite critical, especially during the Delta wave time, because that time almost all countries were experiencing some level of upsurge in the number of cases between April and June of 2021. So that was a very difficult period in terms of sourcing the vaccine ingredients. So yeah, like, these were some of the challenges.
Yeah, and that touches on sort of this third tier of impact. So we have talked a little bit about the first tier that I had noticed, which was the actual implementation and success of the vaccination campaign. And the second tier was more related to some of the social, political, and even economic advancements made during this time to be able to compensate for the disruption caused by the pandemic. But this third tier was quite interesting to me, and that was India's kind of increased role or maybe just a new form of role in diplomacy using vaccine export and support of other countries as kind of a mechanism of diplomacy. Some might argue soft power diplomacy. Others might argue, that it would come from a place of a genuine recognition of some kind of a shared experience across country borders. But it seems like that was a very large and successful effort. I think I had seen that by the end, or at least to date, over 100 countries have received vaccines from India, primarily lower and middle income countries. But I was curious what the nature of discourse was, kind of what the public dialogue was around that topic early on in the process. Were people celebratory of and encouraging of those steps to be able to export some of the vaccines to other countries? Did they understand the purpose and benefits of doing that? Was there any pushback? Just curious a little more about how people reacted to that.
Yeah, again, this was seen as like a duty that, okay, if you had vaccines, you should be able to share with others. In fact, if you see in the early parts, so, our vaccination program began on 16th of January, 2021. And the first batch of vaccine export happened on 18th of January. So practically the day that we started our vaccination, the same day we started exporting the vaccine. So the first batch reached some countries on 18th. And this was, like the importance of this, you can see by the fact that the heads of state in some countries came to receive the vaccines at the airport, because for them, it was a big thing. They quite realized that if these vaccines were not available, perhaps they would not get any vaccine at all, given that there was such a long queue of the countries claiming vaccines. Some countries had placed advance orders. They had given money to the companies as an advance for supplying them vaccines when they were ready. So there was the commodity was very scarce, but the demand was almost infinite at that point of time. So several countries acknowledged that. Even like a few weeks back, there was a United Nations conference where several of these members came and spoke on record on the UN platform that how they were very impressed by the way the approach that India took on this count. And I mean, you can even call it like it was casting bread upon the water. So you don't have to always look for a quid pro quo or something in return. But this was one of the gestures that you do something good because you want to do something good. And what transpired was that in several small countries like island nations and some of our neighbors, we almost gave the number of doses which India gave. And by gave, I mean some were grants, some were commercial terms, some were through the COVAX alliance. But the number of doses which India supplied actually were enough to vaccinate all of their population twice, for two doses. So we didn't just vaccinate ourselves; we actually vaccinated several other countries in the entirety. So I think that was a great feeling. When you read the book and you were researching, it was great to really read some of these stories from the other aspect, right? Not in our media or not from our leaders, but to hear them talk about it.
So to add to that, there's a reference in the book, and this is a paper by the National Institute of Health about the economic impact of the vaccine production by the Serum Institute of India on the global south. And this is across many different vaccines that have been delivered by this company over the past, I think, 10 to 15 years, and they amount to avoiding healthcare costs to the order of $250 billion. So the SII is the world's largest vaccine producer, and in terms of pure production capability, India does have a substantial capability, probably one of the highest, if not the highest in the world. But it took time for India to wrap up vaccination. In April, things were truly dire-looking, in May too, but starting June, things changed quickly, and statistically, India did approximately well over 500 million doses, both in the third and fourth quarter of 2021. So after that really hard start during those months of April and May, people did ask, why are we exporting nothing? Stop exporting things. First, let's do things at home. That was natural and expected. But that phase lasted maybe a month and a half, that's all. But afterwards, the kind of whole vaccine shortage thing essentially evaporated. So along with that, any kind of opposition to exporting elsewhere also evaporated, because a couple of months onwards, for the rest of the whole year, we were averaging about 6 million vaccinations every single day, through the whole of the half of the year, and that's a huge number. Anybody who were to get vaccinated could just show up. There was nothing to wait for anymore. So that completely changed the narrative around having people being opposed to exporting anything, because that was truly no longer a problem anymore after mid-2021, and still hasn't been.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I hadn't quite thought about it, but I guess if you eliminate the pressures of perceived scarcity, now there's no longer a question about whether or not we need to make a decision between kind of protecting people at home or helping to support a broader global community, because there's an acknowledgement that both are important and there's a way to do both simultaneously. And so it may be that in some other country contexts where they were feeling that scarcity in a different way, or maybe didn't have that in-house manufacturing capacity, some of the models or some of the programs and policies implemented in India wouldn't necessarily be adaptable if that pressure of scarcity is on people's minds. But it sounds like there was sort of a unique combination of factors here, and also these cultural values associated with duty to country, duty to community, and then also a broader duty to be sort of a good neighbor and a good partner with other countries, that all factored into what sounds like it was a fairly cohesive and coordinated national response.
And just to give you some data, Rachel, so we have exported, or we have given or supplied in various forms about 300 million doses of vaccines. So that was 2.2 billion in India, and then 300 million to other countries. The number could be smaller than some of what the developed countries have eventually done in the last, like 2 years. Perhaps some of them are nearing 1 billion doses supplied. But our 300 million were very well targeted, where they were given to countries which were generally like the global south, the lower middle income countries, and they wouldn't have otherwise got vaccines. So it was not just that we supplied the vaccines. It was also the fact that the timing of when we did, and like who we chose to kind of give them to. So I think those were two very critical differences for our exports relative to what other, maybe the more developed countries have done.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to know, in some other countries, so I can certainly speak to my experience personally only in the US and then where I was in West Africa. But I'm wondering, even in observation or reading about some other country contexts, I know that there were some issues not directly related to vaccination or vaccination related outcomes, but kind of the longer term health impacts and outcomes associated with COVID. So things like in certain countries, we saw an increase in episodes of domestic violence because people were isolating at home. In some countries, we saw that even if people were getting vaccinated, there were still disparate health outcomes across racial and ethnic groups based on systemic racism, or certain groups not having access to follow-on care that they needed. Are there any issues like that maybe were not directly related to vaccination, but still were quite persistent in the Indian context that affected some of those challenges that maybe contributed to the whole experience of developing and implementing this program?
I can take this one actually. So on the vaccine front, Rachel, we had, so as Suraj had explained, the vaccine procurement was central, and then it was being given to different states on basis of some perceived threat or perceived risk or their capacity to administer doses. So there was some, let's say, discontent at some points that the state said, okay, I should be getting more vaccines, etc. But those were handled administratively. So it did not reach a situation where there were conflicts in any state for the vaccine. Like, of course, there were some criticism at times, but it's part of the process. It's such a huge exercise that it was very difficult to say that everything would be perfect. But nothing really, in terms of like a long-standing, situation of conflict between social groups, etc. That we did not face, because eventually people kind of adjusted to the pace at which in the initial months the vaccines were being delivered. Later on, of course, as Suraj explained, things became quite on demand, so it did not really matter. So the first about 6 months, that situation had to be managed through a fairly active intervention of who the vaccine goes to, and which states, which city, etc. The other part was on the kind of side effects, or let's say the second order effects of COVID. So India had a helpline again, system where you could reach out in case you had a perceived risk of domestic violence or depression or other kind of mental situations, I mean, mental illness situations, because it was bound to happen with people isolating. Other thing is because our family structures are fairly robust. Like a lot of people still don't live alone. Like they live with their families. Even youngsters who are working, but they would typically be living with the families. So there was some social support available in the vicinity, or it was at hand. If you were still alone, you could kind of reach out to friends and family. So I think there was a bit of a social support also, which probably was a little different. But there were options of reaching out for specific helplines which were set up, especially for women. There's a ministry called Women's and Child Development, so they had set up a helpline specifically for women to kind of address these issues, what you mentioned. And thankfully, of course, there would have been problems, some cases or some extreme events, but nothing emerged as a big pattern or either geographically or in terms of the type of anything really going wrong in a big way. Thankfully, that did not happen. But of course, we continue to not know what the long COVID effects are, right? So I think that we'll have to deal with over our lifetimes as to what else has gone wrong with us. We don't know.
To add together add some color over here and connect together a couple of threads that Ashish mentioned just now and earlier. So state government did struggle to establish how to vaccinate in time. And that's because of what she mentioned earlier about India having a migrant population. Now there's a lot of construction and activity going on in various parts. Certain states faster, there's a lot of roads and train tracks and everything being built. So there's a migrant population of approximately 300 million people. That's about the population of the United States, who had to move back when the economy essentially ground to a stop in May and June. So they had to be managed, and the state governments had to keep track of exactly how many people, because there's a lot of people who are just moving back. And there exists their free food supplementation program providing extra food to 800 million people that's been on since April 2020 and is still going on. So that's for free, and that's handed out through the Aadhaar cards, which identify everybody uniquely and is therefore capable of delivering that to the person correctly. So they had these challenges outside of vaccination because there's a large number of people there who are just moving between what's like South Central India and Northeastern India, and who at any point of time may be anywhere in between those two places and still have to be vaccinated and their regular lives taken care of wherever they are.
Yeah, you actually just touched on something that had occurred to me a little bit before as another feature of India's system that to me seems a bit distinctive, at least relative to what we're more familiar with in the States. And that is related to that sort of food and social service support provision being, at least in theory, inextricably linked with health, public health programming. And in some other contexts, food and nutrition, dental care, vision care, et cetera, are seen as being completely independent from health and medical care provision. And I feel like in at least what I know of the models of those programs, there are features that could be adapted and used in other settings, or that other settings could look to as exemplars for the types of social support services that could be implemented to help promote the yield of improved health outcomes. Another approach that Ashish, I think you mentioned earlier, was helping to train, whether it was community health workers or other individuals who are already trusted by certain rural or peripheral communities to be the messengers of important information. That's a best practice in health communications and engagement in intervention delivery that I think some countries implement quite well, others maybe not as well. So I was wondering if there are other aspects of this model that you think other countries could consider picking up and replicating, recognizing that some of the features of those countries are going to be a bit different and it's not necessarily generalizable across all.
I would say that some of the areas are quite replicable. For example, the use of technology. We call it the digital public infrastructure. Coven is an example of that. So this is like national public technology infrastructure, which is built by the government, but anyone else can build on top of it. So you can have, these are like open platforms, open access platforms. You can access them through application programming interfaces where you can build your own dashboards or your own, let's say, data analytics on top of the national data which is being captured. Of course, the data which is exposed is not personal data; it is collective, grouped data. But there's this, like, the whole approach of digital public infrastructure is something which is certainly replicable, and it goes beyond health. I mean, COVID is just one example, but there's a lot which, even the food security, which Suraj said, that's based on another technology platform called One Nation, One Ration Card, which is that I can authenticate. I mean, let's say I'm a migrant worker, I work in Mumbai, but I go back to my village 2,000 kilometers away. I can take my the permissible quantum of food grains 1 month in Mumbai and the second month in my village, because I'll be authenticated using the Aadhaar system. So the government knows that the 1 month I'm taking it from the fair price shop in one state, the next month I could be in another location. So this is kind of allowed. So this technology layer is a great potential, transfer.
Yeah.
It has got great transferability to other countries.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it sounds like you have this sort of centralized structure, or at least some kind of national level policies and programs in place, but those afford this additional level of flexibility, whether it's flexibility to be able to move about the country as you need and still access those benefits, or flexibility to take an existing platform and build on top of that, or further extrapolate using national data and then other data that you have access to, presumably in above board ways. But I think that combination of something that adds structure and stability and is centralized in some way, but then also affords a certain kind of flexibility and honors and acknowledges people's agencies and differences in terms of need, is probably something that is a notable takeaway for other countries to consider. Like, striking that balance, while very difficult, seems like it yields positive results.
Point Ashish is making here that fundamentally you still need the ability to track things on a national scale here to execute nationally, and if there's no single common denominator that you can use, that becomes almost impossible. And to give you a very simple example, in the 60s, even when the twin thing needle was used to perform smallpox vaccinations, India preferred to stick with the older rotary lancet simply because it left a scar on people, so you could actually look at their arms and say they've been vaccinated. So you didn't have to do the same thing twice over, because they may have no idea when you ask them, have you been vaccinated, what you're talking about. So it's as simple as that. You need to be able to manage things nationally, and you need some kind of identifiable basis. And the concept of a national ID is probably unworkable in many countries, but it just works in India because it's already there. It's used for a range of things, and the covered response is just one layer on top.
Well, and I think to be able to implement something like that in a country with such a sizable population and such a complex and nuanced even economic and political structure is notable. And even if other countries haven't yet mobilized to be able to do that, seeing that it can be done and that it can be done in this way and yields benefits, maybe can be kind of a motivator for others in an important way. I can definitely attest to the fact that that is one of the most important things that a national health system or public health service can do, is create that central structure for being able to collect and integrate data and then actually generate evidence-based insights based on that. I just had one final question for you both. I think the book that you both wrote was phenomenal, comprehensive. It's a big undertaking to try to cover not only the technical aspects of the development and deployment of a campaign like this, but also to go into some of the economic implications and to use data and evidence to support your arguments. I think it's probably the kind of checks that people will look to in future to get a holistic picture of how this played out. And so I'm curious to know what prompted you to write the book, and what is your hope for kind of the next wave of India's response to whatever the next series of challenges is that COVID-19 presents.
Suraj, maybe I'll take it. So, so on the book, the reason we wrote, Rachel, it was as Suraj earlier mentioned. We were in touch through this process in terms of exploring what is going on, explaining it on social media, on our various social feeds, or writing articles about this. So at some point we thought that, this is actually a big achievement. It should be documented in one place. And as you rightly said, we do intend this to be like the reference work for the program many years down the line. So what happens is when you are experiencing something and you've achieved something, sometimes you tend to undervalue it because it's kind of part of your life, and you almost expect that it should have happened this way. But I think what is not very clear is that there was no guarantee when COVID hit us that India would actually have any vaccine at all. So from the fact that you had the vaccine access, you were able to make it available, and you were able to make it affordable. This like a AAA rated vaccine program, as we call it. I think this is something which was quite unique. So that was the motivation for us to write. In terms of, if you see the national response for the next steps, there's a lot of investment which is happening on the healthcare infrastructure in terms of research, in terms of vaccine capacities. Some of the private players, like one of the private players, Serum Institute, is now up to 4 billion doses a year, that they could do 4 billion a year vaccine doses just by themselves. This is just one company. So I think there's a lot of investment which has gone through. But in terms of, what we hope is that the lessons and the playbook which was created in this crisis could then be used in other places wherever we are trying to solve a national scale challenge, right? So be it in terms of, let's say, education or in terms of industrial development, research in our universities and academic institutions. I think those are the areas where the playbook which was developed in COVID or in the vaccination phase can be applied in an interchangeable or in a fungible manner. So that's the hope, and we look forward to hopefully chronicling some of those successes as well at some point of time.
Just a little bit to that, I'd say that the COVID response in India was really an act of heroism, and on many levels, from top to the bottom. A lot of people did their roles and did so successfully. And there were many little things that we got right in past efforts, but in this case, everything came together well. And I just wanted to try to chronicle the fact that this is now a working systemic capability to deliver on the scale. And therefore, in future, it could just become something mundane and expected to have the entire infrastructure to do, because it's been demonstrated once and very well. So if that can be done, that would be something worth chronicling, because there's a playbook in place.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And I think you're right, Ashish, that when going through something as destabilizing and collectively disconcerting as a global pandemic of this scale, I think it's really difficult for people to pause and reflect on what's working, or to even take stock of what's changing over time, because ultimately whole systems and societies are in survival mode and are much more reactionary, such that it prevents them from being proactive or thoughtful and introspective about what has worked. So I think you both accomplished quite a lot in taking that moment to pause and essentially analyze what is a very strong use case for an effective campaign. I agree that there are a lot of things about India's response that can serve as a model for other countries. I know it's been celebrated as such by leaders at the WHO and elsewhere. So definitely want to take time to applaud your work. Thank you for the time that you shared with us today. It's been wonderful to chat with you and to learn more about your take on this and some of the nuances of the situation in India. And then for the benefit of our listeners, I'll just acknowledge that I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. I do encourage you all to follow the Fair Observer YouTube channel. And beyond that, I'll thank everyone for their time. And until next time, thanks for your participation.
Thank you, Rachel.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.